Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm Derivative, and if you've been around the channel, you probably know me for, well, the other stuff. But today, I'm changing things up a bit because I just got back from seeing the Godzilla movie yesterday, and I absolutely have to gush about this movie. It was amazing. Basically, I've been a Godzilla fan for a really long time, so when I saw the trailers, I was really excited to see this movie. In fact, I was gonna try to drop this review yesterday, but I just had just so many thoughts, just so many things I wanted to, get on paper and get out to you guys that I had to take the time to try to even do this movie justice. So I don't want to keep you any longer. Let's just get into it. But, first a few disclaimers. First things first, this is roughly going to be a beat for beat, kind of. But that also means there's going to be spoilers. Sorry, not sorry. And apologies if my editing quality isn't really up to snuff compared to my other stuff. I just really wanted to get this out the door to you guys as soon as I could. And after thinking about this, I'm pretty sure this is going to get copyright claimed, but I don't really care. I just want to get my thoughts out there. I just want to share everything, just all my thoughts with you guys. And probably the most important disclaimer is that this movie does touch on sensitive topics like PTSD, survivor's guilt, and obviously the historical context of World War II on the Japanese side, right? Because the movie takes place between 1945 and 1947. Now, I'm not a historian professionally, and I'm absolutely not a mental health professional, so when we get to those parts of the movie, I almost certainly won't do those topics justice, and I do apologize in advance. So what did I think about the movie? Well, if it hasn't been obvious already, I absolutely love this movie. And heck, I think I'd even go so far as to say is I liked it even more than any of the Legendary stuff. The Godzilla 2014, the King of the Monsters, Godzilla vs. Kong, all of that stuff. And I feel like that's actually not too unpopular of an opinion at this point. Like, I always find it when America does their spin on Godzilla, and don't get me wrong, like the Legendary verse stuff is still really entertaining and really fun, but then Toho throws their hat in the ring and they're like, all right, let's just show you how it's done. So I mean, obviously this movie is a 10 out of 10, highly recommend, right? And there's a heated debate to be had around, well, is this movie better than the original one, right? Than the 1954 one? And I would say from a technical standpoint, absolutely, right? I mean, that should be pretty obvious. But I got to thinking about it and, don't get me wrong, like I still think this movie, solid 10 out of 10, definitely go see it. But I still think that like the 1954 one takes the cake, and I don't think it's even close, right? Like you're gonna have people falling into those two different camps, and you know what? That's totally fine. But I'm still like a 1954 stan, kind of. Now, that said, like from the trailers, like it looks like, oh, this is gonna like retread a lot of like the old ground of the 1954 one, right? And I'll just get it out of the way that like it does a little bit, like it follows some of the major beats, obviously, but also at the same time, like it stands out on its own as its own movie. And we'll kind of get into that once we talk about like the themes and just like the overall plot, the characters, and that's like another thing about this movie is that it has like solidly developed characters. Unlike some certain recent stuff that we may have seen, right? And especially if we're talking about beloved actors' characters being killed off early, but I digress. Like this movie borrows a lot from the 1954 one, right? Obviously, but it also reminded me a little bit of Shin, but also a ton of GMK, like back in the early 2000s. Like basically, this Godzilla version is a force of nature Godzilla. Like we're not talking about the superhero one, right? Who goes up against like Megalon and old school Mechagodzilla. Like, no, this is force of nature. He needs to be respected. He needs to be feared, and he plays a central role in the main themes of the movie, right? Which I thought was absolutely the way they should have taken this movie. And I think the most important thing to say about the movie before just really getting into it is that this movie felt like a modern version of Godzilla. And that's to say that it has a lot of modern sensibilities. I mean, not just the visual effects and the CGI, but also just how they dealt with the story, what type of story they wanted to tell. It was a very character-driven story. Like I felt like the 1954 one was less about that and more of the overarching themes that they want to convey. But this one was a lot more character-driven, it was a lot more personal, and it mostly followed one guy. If I were to really boil it down, like, yeah, there was a large cast of supporting characters, but it really mostly followed the one guy, which would say, oh, wow, let's have more Godzilla. But I feel like they struck like a decent balance. I would have liked to have a little bit more Godzilla, but I feel like overall, like, they struck a really good balance for having a modern movie movie in the 2020s, right? Anyway, so let's just go ahead. So it starts off over on Odo Island, right, where this young kamikaze pilot, I forget if he is actually introduced as a kamikaze pilot or if that's like much later and it's heavily hinted at. Anyway, the guy's name is Shikishima, and he heads on over to Odo Island to park his plane. Odo Island, by the way, big Easter egg reference, right? And there's like a ton of those throughout the movie. You know, it's like, yeah, it does touch on the 1954 stuff, but it's Easter eggs and homages, right? Anyway, so Shikishima, he brings his plane over to Odo Island for repairs, right? Like he wasn't able to participate in some dogfight towards the end of World War II. But then the guy looking at it says, well, I noticed something a little bit off about your plane. Like there should be, and it looks like there's nothing wrong with it. And this right here is where we start seeing the central conflict, right? Like really what this whole movie is going to be about. And I feel like that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? So basically we find out, or it's heavily implied, and you know, later they reveal that he was basically a deserter. Like he abandoned his post as a kamikaze pilot, and he gets a lot of heat for this throughout the movie, and we'll touch on that a bit probably. So as I'm watching this in the first 5 minutes, I'm going, okay, like this is the central conflict. Like he's going to try to face his demons multiple times. Sometimes he'll succeed, sometimes he'll fail, but ultimately like he's gonna have some type of redemption arc at the end, right? Like is he gonna have the sacrifice play? Is he just gonna have like a big heroic moment? Like you don't really know. But if you get that in the first 5 minutes like I did, I don't feel like that actually detracts from the movie. I don't know, let's take a couple of things that I have no expertise about, like professional wrestling or gymnastics. Like you know what you're going for, right? Like you're there to see a good gymnastics routine, you're there to see some, well, professional wrestling. But does that in itself like really detract from the experience that you're gonna have? No, not really. What really matters is the end, is like kind of the journey, right? Like are you going to be entertained while watching this? You know the beginning, you know the end, but are you going to be entertained? Oh yeah, and it should go without saying that like his redemption arc, you know, it's most likely going to involve Godzilla, right? And him coming head to head with Godzilla. Which brings us to the next big scene. So Shikishima, a bunch of other soldiers, like they're just sleeping overnight, minding their own business, and then suddenly, boom, huge rumbling sound, right? Like it's probably Godzilla, you don't know, but probably. And you're waiting for the reveal, and then boom, there he is. He's tiny, and he's kind of adorable. Well, more like terrifyingly adorable. Again, Easter eggs, references, like this one kind of reminded me of the Godzillasaurus from the Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, right? And he even has like that hunched over posture, like a T-Rex from like Jurassic Park, right? So I don't know, I thought that was pretty cool. And speaking of T-Rex, he just like slaughters people, right? Like he's just picking them up like rag dolls and tossing them around with his mouth. And that's the other thing that I loved about this movie, right? Like within the first 10 minutes, it just set the stakes right away about what the central human-driven conflict is going to be, right, with Shikishima, and just like what type of Godzilla we're going to be dealing with. Like sure, he hasn't had like his power glow up or anything, not yet, but like just in terms of personality, like this thing kills for sport, this thing is territorial, this thing is an animal and a monster. So again, boom, setting the stakes right in the beginning, but you know that like you're in for a ride. And here we see Shikishima, like he's trying to be the hero and he can't do it. Like he's asked by the soldiers like, hey, can't you go over to your fighter plane that you brought and just shoot him? And he just can't. Like would that have really done anything to him? Like probably not, but you see the point. So Shikishima, he gets knocked out, but then when he comes to, he sees that everybody's dead. All the soldiers that he came to know over like the past day, they're all dead. Except for one guy, and that's Tachibana. And again, this whole Survivors Guild thing like keeps building and building. Now you have Tachibana telling him, hey, everybody's dead and it's your fault. So Tachibana and Shikishima, like they both get picked up by the Japanese Navy and then they get sent home. And for Shikishima, that's Tokyo. And again, when he goes back home, just more Survivors Guild. Like when he gets back to Tokyo, he finds that everything's in ruins due to the fire bombings. And when he gets back home, he finds out that his parents are dead. But not only that, but this neighbor Sumiko, she adds on the Survivors Guild. She's saying that you should have died with honor. Now, what I really liked about the movie is that a couple of times, like he's sitting there thinking about his parents and how they actually wanted him to live, which I feel like was great. Like everybody in the movie could have been against him and told him that he should have died with honor. But I feel like what was really great about the movie is that it allowed for exploration of very complicated opinions about the US government, the Japanese government, about people's involvement in the war. Like it didn't try to express only one type of opinion through this movie. Imagine commentary in a Godzilla movie, right? Speaking of which, one thing I didn't really expect from a Godzilla movie was to laugh a little bit, at least not recently, which actually kind of brings us to the next part, because he's like putzing around and trying to figure out how to pick up the pieces and rebuild a little bit, but not really. But then suddenly this girl, like she just runs along and she's just like, here, hold this. And you're just like, wait, what the heck? And then you're like, oh my God, he's holding a child now. Hi, Dad. And that didn't even take me out of the movie. I was just like, wait, what? This isn't a Godzilla movie? This is amazing. Absolutely adorable. So anyway, he eventually meets back up with the girl. Her name is Noriko, and she kind of becomes like a roommate, I guess. So look, there's like romantic undertones heavily implied, but it's like not really clear, like where did they actually do anything romantic? Like I kind of don't think so. I think they kind of just ended up being like adoptive parents who were like really just like good roommates. So anyway, this is where we are, right? Like now they're living together, trying to find a way to raise the baby. All while Shikishima is of course dealing with the survivor's guilt, like even having like nightmares. And at some point, and you know, forgive me, I'm gonna like kind of screw up the order of things, like we get kind of a cutaway to this MacArthur stuff, like an announcement saying that, hey, look, there's been some big deep sea creature causing a lot of trouble in the ocean, and that like it needs to be taken care of. So then that leads to Shikishima getting a government job, right? But this is one thing I liked about the movie. Like it wasn't afraid to make like those quippy kind of like Marvel-like jokes. And I don't know, when Marvel does it, sometimes it could be a bit too much, but I feel like in the Godzilla movie, like it was fine. And he was like, oh man, they gave me a 3,000 yen down payment. Like it's gonna be great. We're gonna be able to make a living and start rebuilding. And it cuts away to him looking at the harbor and he's like, oh, it's just a tiny wooden boat. And then he basically gets introduced to like his ride or die squad. Now I'm not gonna remember any of their names. I'm sorry if anyone was like a real fan of those characters. But in my opinion, like as far as the main story goes, like it really just centralized around Shikishima for the most part, right? Like I feel like everybody was just a character that kind of tied into his story. So anyway, like their big job is to go out to the ocean and take care of sea mines, right? Like basically like a lot of sea mines that were left around from the war. And at some point, like while they're taking on this job, so like Shikishima, he's basically like the sharpshooter because he's a pilot, right? So he knows how to shoot. And basically they're ordered like, okay, go out there and see if you can take care of this monster. And they realize real quick, like, wait, we're not actually meant to dealt with this thing. Like we're basically stalling. We're kind of bait. So they're out there with another boat and the other boat absolutely gets decimated. Like he just comes up and just takes a big chomp like, snack. And it's basically like, I think you're gonna need a bigger boat. Speaking of which, oh my God, they had a Jaws reference, a literal Jaws reference. I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. Kind of cool how like it comes around full circle. Like basically like the ride or die squad, like he starts chasing their boat and they happen to have like a couple of the sea mines like on their boat. So basically they're like, hey, let's try to like decimate this thing by blowing up sea mines. They try one, like on the skin, it doesn't really work. And then they're like, hey, wait a minute, let's try the mouth. And I feel like here they could have gone either way. Like Shikishima, like here he has tremors. So like they could have been like, oh, like he doesn't actually fire. But hey, I think it was nice to show a little growth that like, no, he's trying to get past his guilt and he shoots it and it works. It blows up. They did the Jaws thing. Well, kinda. And here's where we see the really cool stuff that like, oh, you're not dealing with your average Godzilla anymore. Like we find out he has Wolverine healing factor. Like there's a whole chunk of his head missing and it just grows back. And everybody's like, oh heck, we're in too deep. And then suddenly, hey, the cavalry's here, the Navy boat shows up. So hey, that's neat. So what does Godzilla do? I mean, naturally he goes after the bigger fish. And again, it ends in, maybe you guessed it, another Easter egg. Like Godzilla takes a few beefy hits point blank, but then he's like, nah, let me show you how it's done. And then he goes underneath the boat and then fires off his first atomic blast. It's great. It's like a callback to the first movie. So yeah, there you go. And then Godzilla, he just pieces out. So you fast forward a little bit, and again, I feel like I'm kind of screwing up the timeline on the movie a little bit, sorry. But then Noriko, she gets a job over in Ginza, which is like a neighborhood in Tokyo. And then the baby, whose name is Akiko, like she grows up a little bit. By the way, Akiko, underrated, one of the best parts of the movie. I was like, oh my God, protect this child at all costs. And as for the girl, seriously, somebody get her an agent. So anyway, Shikishima, he's still dealing with his guilt. Then he's coming around to, you know what, maybe I can start thinking about building a future. So things are kind of starting to look up. But I mean, we're only about like halfway through the movie, so you know that's not how it's gonna go down. So in the middle of the day, Godzilla, he rolls up to Tokyo, of course. And he rolls up to, you guessed it, Ginza. He does a lot of stuff that is absolutely callbacks to the old movie, right? Like he chomps on the train, he tosses it, and you even get the news reporters on the rooftop who are like trying to cover the story and then they just die. It's great, throwbacks everywhere. But then I also feel like this Godzilla like really differentiated himself here. Like in the original, like obviously it's kind of like limitations of the technology, but he kind of goes from point A to point B and just like kind of destroys whatever's like right in front of him, like right in his way. Like this one like goes out of his way to like tail whip buildings that are like not even in his way just because he feels like it. And this is like another thing that reminded me of the GMK movies, right? Like there's like one part in GMK where he just rolls up to a hospital and then there's this girl there and she's absolutely terrified. And then he leaves, so it looks like everything's fine, right? And then no, he just tail whips the hospital just because he can. So yeah, that Godzilla, kind of a jerk. And the -1 one is absolutely no exception to that. But speaking of, so the Japanese military, like they try to quell Godzilla, they try to put him down, as if like tanks are gonna work against this thing at this point, right? So then we get the big moment, right? Like the one in the trailers. And you know, real quick side note, one thing that I actually really liked about the trailers is that none of them really felt like they gave the movie away. Like they technically did, like 2020 hindsight if you go back and look at the movie, but I feel like they cut it where it's just like I still didn't really know what was going to happen or like how they were going to execute certain stuff, right? Especially the atomic heat ray. Now, I'm a sucker for all of like the old prop stuff, like just prop buildings blowing up everywhere. And if I had to pick my personal favorite heat ray, I have a soft spot for like the 90s stuff, right? Like it's just boom, everything blows up, instantaneous, right? But I think this is like the best looking this ray has looked in a long time. We don't just get a ray, we get a full-on nuclear bomb, like mushroom cloud and everything. And I have to say, this moment, like anytime Godzilla had like a big moment, like when he was coming up to get the ships, or like here as he was charging up, I was in my seat just like giggling. Like I couldn't help but just be excited about this stuff. And it's just so great to be able to have this much fun in a movie in 2023. Like I'm rooting for the people, obviously, like I want them to live, but I'm also rooting for Godzilla. I want him to have his big moments. And then you get this payoff here, like, it's just great. So we get like the mushroom cloud, and they don't hold back on this at all. Buildings are absolutely leveled and everybody dies. Well, I mean like seemingly everybody, right? So during the chaos, Shikishima, like he actually tried to go into Ginza to rescue Noriko. Like he just started getting his life back together, like he's looking to rebuild. And again, romantic undertones, right? Like are they roommates? Like is he looking to rebuild with her, right? Like you don't know. And I don't get too emotional or surprised in movies, but we had a moment where my heart just sank. And you already know what it is. So Noriko makes a sacrifice play, and she shoves him behind a building for him to avoid the nuclear blast, and he doesn't see it coming. So she seemingly gets killed. Like I was pretty convinced that she was dead. Like especially with the way that they play it out later. Like she gets a very drawn out scene with the funeral and everyone is like processing her death. But before that, we get like this ashen rain, like this nuclear fallout from what was basically an atomic bomb. And Shikishima, he is absolutely wrecked at this point. Like if he hadn't hit a low already, like he's there now. And what does Godzilla do? He pieces out. Dingus. So yeah, they have this long funeral sequence about Noriko, and I was pretty sure she was dead at this point. And then people in Tokyo are like, all right, we gotta deal with this thing. So I mean, like, how do we kill it? And again, another point where they clearly differentiate themselves from the 54 one, right? But I mean, it's because they're going for very different themes. Like in the original, you have an endless cycle of destruction, whereas with this one, it's like a lot more of an intimate story about the people, right? Like it's about their relationship with the war, with the government, with the US government, with the Japanese government. And at the end, you have this band of civilians and veterans basically banding it together and saying, no, we need to secure the future of our people. Like we need to protect ourselves against this thing, no matter the cost to us personally. And they deal with it well, right? Like it's not just like a heroic speech and everybody's like, yeah, let's go. Some people get cold feet. They're like, I have a family to go back to, I'm sorry. And you don't really blame them for it. But then there's the ones who do stick around to support a plan that they don't even know if it's going to work, but they've got to try. But speaking of which, at this point in the movie, I thought I was actually going to have like a little nitpick about it. So like their plan basically involves like sinking Godzilla really, really fast into the ocean and then bringing him back up again, right? Like the rapid change in pressure they hope is going to kill him. And then on top of that, Shikishima, he has a secret plan that, okay, like if that's not going to work, I'm going to actually finally redeem myself and do like a kamikaze into his mouth and just try to blow him up from the inside. And I got to thinking, wait, this feels like surprisingly conventional. And I am feeling a little bit robbed, because I mean, to me, rule number one about Godzilla is he does not get killed by conventional weaponry. Like he just can't. And I mean, that's like one place where the TriStar movie obviously screwed up, if you get what I mean. So then when we got to this part, I was just like, oh no. Like I thought he was just gonna die to a bomb in the mouth, and then that was it. And I mean, he kinda does. But again, one thing I really liked about this movie was that Godzilla, he was like freaking Oprah. Like everybody got a happy ending, including weird and giddy little moviegoers like me. So again, they decide on this plan, they get everybody to buy in on it, and then Shikishima, he's like, wait, okay, I gotta get this Tachibana guy. Like they basically resurrect this old plane prototype, but it needs like a mechanic to fix it, and then Shikishima, he's like, wait, okay, I gotta get Tachibana to help me with this. And you know, he literally could have gotten anybody as a mechanic, and they even say as much in the movie, but it's clear why he's doing it, right? Like there's still Survivor's Guild, and maybe he's hoping for some type of forgiveness, but at the same time, right, like his intentions are very clear. Like Shikishima, like he's gonna kamikaze himself. And my god, like freaking Akiko, like she's gonna be like parentless again, what the heck? So he's able to get Tachibana, right? And I mean, Tachibana hasn't forgiven him, obviously, but then he convinces Tachibana that like, no, I'm going to ram this thing into Godzilla's mouth, I'm taking him down with me. And he's honest about it too, at least as far as I could tell. But then as Tachibana's working on the plane, like again, it becomes very clear like how this whole redemption arc is gonna play out, right? Like the camera kind of fixates real briefly on like a label on the plane behind the seat. I didn't really get a chance to read it. I think it was in German, maybe? I don't know. I'm probably wrong about that. And then like after he's done working on the plane and he gets his chance to have a talk with Shikishima about like how the retrofitted plane works, he's like, oh, by the way, there's something else I want to tell you. And then it just like cuts out. Like it doesn't tell you what he's gonna say. So it's like, okay, you already know. Again, knowing does not take away from the quality of the movie. But anyway, so Shikishima, like he gets a chance to say like his last goodbyes, basically. Like he has like a really heart heartfelt conversation with Akiko without really like telling her, and also a little bit with Sumiko. Like he actually leaves like a wad of cash for her. Like he 100% intended to die to redeem himself. But Tachibana, he comes around and he's like, live for the future. Here's the ejector seat, live. And again, I do like how they treated it as a reveal. Like you don't actually find out like he's going to live until like the end, but then you have the big moment, like the big final battle, right? And yeah, it does everything you expect it to. Like he fires off another heat ray, great stuff. Oh yeah, by the way, they had to lure out Godzilla, and then they had a boat that used like a recording of his roar to draw him out, and he just tosses the boat into the harbor. Like he has like the Avengers like boom looking for this, like the roadie thing. I thought that was hilarious. It was cute. But yeah, that crew, like they're definitely dead. They managed to sink him into the ocean really rapidly, and like it does a little bit, like it crushes him a little bit under the pressure, and it's kind of adorable. Like he's about to fire off his heat ray and he just goes bleh. Like it just stops, and then they're like, oh well, he's not dead yet. And now plan B, we gotta raise him up and have that pressure change kill him. But then that doesn't work because he chews through like the balloon that's supposed to raise him up all the way, and then you get the cavalry coming in. Oh yeah, by the way, speaking of which, like I haven't talked about the ride or die guys like enough, obviously, but they're like a great supporting cast in this film. Like the movie would have been so much less without them. Like these guys absolutely needed to be here. So one of them, he like rolls up with a cavalry of like tugboats, and then they're basically pulling like these two battleships to make sure that Godzilla is brought up to the surface and properly dies. But of course he's brought up and he's not dead yet. They do a bunch of damage and he's like, nope, I'm taking you with me. And then the movie gets quiet. Like, okay, so you know they're not going to die, but just the way that they treated the moment, like it gets quiet, things slow down, just people's different reactions to the realization that, well, we did our best, but it looks like this is really it. And then, you know, the sound comes back, and Shikishima, he rolls up in his plane, and he's like, not if I get you first. Oh yeah, by the way, he had to do a lot of work, like luring Godzilla, like, into the harbor, like, exactly where they wanted him to, so, you know, props. Anyway, he rams the plane into Godzilla's mouth, like, just before he gets to fire off his blast. Like, the bombs go off, like, Godzilla basically gets decapitated, and the buildup of nuclear energy, like, he basically just disintegrates and falls to the bottom of the ocean, which is great. Again, like kind of call back to the original, right? Like you want to show that he's like dead, that like this movie had a definitive ending. And again, I thought that I was like gonna be disappointed that Godzilla died due to like more or less conventional means, but I mean he had to have this happy ending, right? Speaking of happy endings, Shikishima, he lives. You know, like he parachutes out, everybody goes home, but then Sumiko rolls up. Like she received a telegram before, and you might be thinking like this is from Shikishima, right? Like he was like, oh JK, I'm gonna live, by the way I need that money back please. But she's like, go to the hospital. And wouldn't you know it, like, hey, even Noriko lives. Turns out she didn't die from the nuclear blast, she just got hit really hard. Now, I know there's like a whole thing about like her radiation sickness, like what's that about? And then some people might disagree, like, oh man, the character should have stayed dead. And I'm still like kind of 50-50 on this one. Like, I don't know, it's nice that he got a happy ending. Otherwise, it's basically Romeo and Juliet, and that's just sad. But then giddy audience members like me get a happy ending. At the very end, you see Godzilla's carcass like sinking to the bottom of the ocean, or at least what's left of it, and then it starts regenerating. Godzilla didn't die to more or less conventional means after all. He just got a really big boo-boo, he needs a nap, and Godzilla will return. Whew. Oh man. Well, if it wasn't apparent that I love this movie, it is now. And sorry, I feel like I kind of went beat for beat without really like explaining the different aspects that I really loved about the movie, like a little bit. So I mean, I'll just do it here. And I mean, I'll start with the nitpicks. Like I don't really have many, like maybe just a couple. Like one obviously was like, should Noriko have died? Should she have not? That wasn't really a nitpick. Like I was just kind of 50-50 on it. And there were like a couple of parts where I thought that like the special effects kind of broke down. Like not many, but then there's like one part where Shikishima, like he's having a dream sequence back to Odo Island, and it has like this layer of smoke, and then he looks up and then he sees Godzilla, or like the tiny version. And I saw it, it did kind of take me out of the movie for like a quick second, because like Godzilla in that form, like he doesn't really look good. Like obviously the budget was spent on like the bigger form, like we gotta get this one right at least. But then there's a smoke dot gif that just appears around Shikishima as he's like standing there. Like they didn't even try to make it look natural. And I feel like the last nitpick was like, okay, so I'm like a Godzilla fan, and I loved the musical stings, like all the music references that they sprinkled throughout. Like it didn't take me out, like I just ate them up. Like I was that guy in the theater who was just laughing incessantly, like to myself of course, like I'm not gonna be a jerk about it, but I was just like giggling with joy. Like there was like one while he was invading Tokyo, and I'm pretty sure they played like a part of the Mothra theme, and I was like, what? Like that's a little weird. But again, not enough to take me out of the movie. All right, so on to the stuff that was great. Like obviously the characters, right? Like the character development, the character arcs. It did, I think in my opinion, centralize around around one character. Like, even though there's a very large supporting cast, like, clearly the story they wanted to tell centralized around Shikishima, right? Again, not necessarily bad. Like, I feel like every character was important, and like screen time wasn't really wasted. And the way that they set him up, like, it was very clear what his arc was going to be, like where he was going to start in the movie, and like how it was going to play off of Godzilla, and like where it was going to go. Like, you didn't know if he was going to die or live, but you knew like he was going to have a redemption arc. And it's because of how character driven this movie was that I feel like this really brought Godzilla into the modern age. And of course, like the legendary stuff, like big technical movies, right? Like, obviously they blow a lot of the budget on the CG and, you know, getting like big name actors into the movies. And they're doing a good job over here on the Western Hemisphere setting up a monsterverse and getting people like really invested into like a franchise, right? But like, I always felt like there was something from each movie that was like missing, that like if you just had all of the right elements in one place, like you would have like an unironically good movie. Like, the first one was like obviously too dark, like literally physically too dark, and it was like hard to see some things in the movie. Whereas like for the second one, like they had a lot of really good action sequences and a really good use of the IPs. And I actually really loved the Godzilla theme in like King of the Monsters. But again, those human characters, And then of course Godzilla vs. Kong, like it's just a slugfest, and I love that part of it. But it felt like they kind of underused their IPs. Like, I don't think Godzilla's theme showed up there at all. And don't even get me started on Mechagodzilla's design. But I feel like Godzilla Minus One, like it just hit everything just right. Like the characters, no matter how big or how small, absolutely solid. And the Godzilla design, sick as hell. Like, it took the best parts of everything. Like, he had a little head like the 90s one, right? So, you know, my childhood brain is like squealing with joy. And his spines, like they kind of reminded me of the 2000s design, and they actually made his swimming like look really good. Like, if they were to do like Jaws in 2023, like this is how you would do it. And speaking of looking good, like that atomic breath, chef's kiss. I mean, people are going around saying like, oh, it's the most powerful atomic breath ever. I don't think so. Like, I wholeheartedly disagree with that. Like, obviously, I think Final Wars takes that cake, and it's not even close, right? Like, I mean, like that version of Godzilla, like he just tanks a whole meteor. But I mean, still, that doesn't take away from Minus One at all. Like, just the way they show the devastation, the destruction, the fallout afterwards, like, amazing. So yeah, like the design of Godzilla overall, like really sick. And even the way they treated Godzilla, right? Like, again, they were feeding off of the 54, like maybe a little bit of the Shin, and I was getting like some serious GMK vibes. But also, rule number one of Godzilla, conventional firearms, they can't kill him. And somehow they found a way to really just make everybody happy. Like, for modern moviegoers, like you gotta have those character arcs and payoffs, right? So they technically beat him. But then for Godzilla fans, it's like, wait, like there's no way this would beat him. And it doesn't. Like, he just has to take a long nap, that's all. So yeah, I feel like, and again, I didn't really touch that much on like the intricate details of PTSD or survivor's guilt, or even just like the historical context, because it mostly takes place between like 1945 and 1947, right? When like the war is fresh on everyone's minds and like Japan is like still rebuilding. I'm just not expert enough to talk about that stuff here. I do apologize for that. But the one thing I really want to cap this review off with is, well, you got this debate about like, is this better than the 1954 one? And I think it's an apples and oranges comparison, honestly. Because, okay, like I said before, like this is the best modern version of Godzilla. Like, it just strikes all the right balance of the effects and the storytelling to really just hit like a modern vibe and sensibilities, I think. And to really just like tell more of like a character-driven story. But then you have like the 1954 one, and don't get me wrong, like you do have like a lot of character-driven stuff there, right? I mean, Dr. Serizawa being like the number one that comes to everyone's minds, but it was a lot more about like the bigger themes that were at play. And they did a lot more world building. Like Minus One, like they didn't waste their time on that, and I thought that was actually really good. They were just like, you know what Godzilla is, you know what he's about. Like, we're not gonna waste your time in 2023 to go over this stuff. Just sit back and enjoy. But you know, they had like a lot of legwork back in 1954, and I think it played really well into the storytelling. Like, basically what they were trying to say is, here's a monster of our own making, and how do we end up destroying it? Like, by creating another monster of our own making. Like, the only thing that could have killed Godzilla was something worse than Godzilla, like the oxygen destroyer, right? So how do you get your cake and eat it too? Well, the progenitor of the oxygen destroyer, like, he has to die. And I still think it's like the saddest movie out of all of them. Like, there's like a scene with a mother and a child, and she's like, you're going to be able to see your dad soon, as like Godzilla decimates everything. And of course there's the choir scene, and I'm sure there wasn't a dry eye in the theater at the time. And I mean, of course there's like the ending, because it's not a happy ending. Whereas in Minus One, like, like there's a happy ending. So yeah, like I feel like the two movies are doing two very different things, and that's okay. But I mean, if you wanted me to pick one over the other, I'm gonna have to go with the 1954. And it's because when you put everything together, it's the movie that like really wants you to think. Like it really wants you to sit with it after the theater, right? I mean, at least for the adults. For like little kids like myself, like we just wanted to see more Godzilla. But I mean, it's like still that movie that I would unironically recommend to people who have never really seen a kaiju movie in their life. And I still can't get over the hand puppet that they use sometimes in that movie. I think it was absolutely adorable. But anyway, enough about that. I digress. So let's go ahead and wrap this up. Yeah, Godzilla Minus One, 10 out of 10. Highly recommend it. And for that, thank you for watching or listening, however you decide to ingest this. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.